Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into an explosive scientific mystery that is, well, it's quietly but completely rewriting human history as we know it. For decades, the story of how humans first set foot in the Americas was treated like a closed book. We thought we had the dates, the routes, the whole shebang neatly tied up. But recently, all this new evidence unearthed from deep ancient mud, hidden in Ice Age DNA, and scattered along our coastlines, it has absolutely shattered that old consensus. Okay, let's dive into this. Who were the very first people to venture into these vast, completely unknown continents of North and South America? And exactly when? And honestly, how did they pull off this incredible journey? To figure this out, we need to look at the latest, most groundbreaking discoveries that are literally sending shockwaves through the fields of archaeology and genetics right now. 23,000. Now, for anyone who's followed North American archaeology, seeing this number is a massive wait, what moment. For the longest time, the absolute earliest timeline for humans in the Americas was strictly capped at around 13,000 years ago. But 23,000 years? That represents the age of fossilized human footprints recently confirmed in North America. It pushes our entire timeline back by a staggering 10 millennia. And these aren't just any footprints either. They were found perfectly preserved in an ancient lake bed at White Sands National Park in New Mexico. When they were first discovered, critics were super skeptical. They argued that the aquatic seeds used to date them might have just absorbed older carbon from the lake water, skewing the results. But a follow-up study actually analyzed the ancient mud right from the strata surrounding the prints. They ran 55 separate radiocarbon dates from independent labs, and the results were rock solid. These tracks were made between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. That places humans in New Mexico right smack in the middle of the last glacial maximum. Section 1. The Clovis First Myth, the Fallen Dogma. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how clearly it shows the dogma those footprints completely destroyed. For almost a century, the scientific community was totally locked into this theory that dictated exactly how and when the Americas were populated. It was called the Clovis First Theory, arguing that the first Americans were these big game hunters who arrived roughly 13,000 years ago by walking south through an inland ice-free corridor in Canada. But as you can see, the new paradigm completely replaces this. The evidence now points to an arrival 20,000 plus years ago, involving a coastal migration by people who were here way, way before the Clovis culture even existed. Section 2. Defining the Geography, a world of ice and grass. So how did they actually get here? Well, to understand their journey, we kind of have to completely erase our modern map of the world and look at what Earth's geography looked like back then. You've probably heard of the Bering Land Bridge, right? Well, forget the word bridge. That implies some narrow little causeway that people just rushed across. In reality, Beringia was a massive habitable subcontinent. We're talking a 1,000-mile-wide stretch of grassy plains connecting Siberia and Alaska that was larger than the state of Texas. It was a lush homeland where families lived, hunted megafauna, and thrived for thousands of years, completely unaware they were standing between two continents. It was just a totally different world. But here's the catch. While Beringia was perfectly habitable, the path further south absolutely was not. This was during the last glacial maximum, literally the most brutal freeze of the Ice Age. Earth's water was locked up in monstrous ice sheets, some of them 2 miles thick, sprawling all across North America. To put that into perspective, that brutal freeze dropped global sea levels by 400 feet, which is what exposed Beringia in the first place, but it simultaneously created an impassable wall of ice, blocking any path down into the rest of the Americas. Yet, humans are incredibly resilient. Look at this data from Lake E5 on Alaska's North Slope. Scientists actually pulled up sediment archives from the lake bed and found fecal biomarkers and campfire charcoal dating all the way back to the last glacial maximum. That's right, ancient proof of campfires. This proves that not only were humans present in this incredibly harsh Arctic environment, but they were actively burning biomass and successfully living alongside Ice Age megafauna long before that ice ever started to melt. Section 3. Secrets in Ancient DNA, the Genetic Detective Work. So we know they were hanging out in Beringia and Alaska, but who exactly were they? To answer that, we have to shift our investigation away from ancient mud and dirt and look directly into human genetics. And wow, the genetic timeline tells an incredibly complex story of movement and mixing. It kicks off 31,600 years ago with the ancient North Siberians, who were identified from these tiny milk teeth found near Russia's Yana River. Fast forward to around 23,000 years ago, and these Siberians mixed with migrating East Asians. By 20,000 years ago, this merged group split to form a basal American branch. And then, about 15,700 years ago, we see another huge genetic divergence between northern and southern Native American lineages. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how complex this family tree is. Ancient DNA reveals these fascinating ghost populations, like the ancient North Siberians and ancient Beringians. They were absolutely crucial to the early genetic mix, but they eventually vanished, leaving no direct living descendants today. And then, of course, you have the ancestral Native Americans, whose lineages split and spread, ultimately becoming the incredibly diverse indigenous peoples living throughout the Americas today. Section 4. The Kelp Highway Route, Bypassing the Ice. This genetic split and southward expansion brings us right back to our massive geographical problem. We know they moved south 20,000 years ago, right? But that inland ice-free quarter we talked about earlier, it was frozen completely solid until about 13,800 years ago. So put yourself in their shoes for a second. If you're a hunter-gatherer living in Alaska 20,000 years ago, how on earth do you bypass an impassable 2-mile-high wall of ice covering all of Canada to end up in places like New Mexico? Well, if the inland route was closed, there was really only one other way to go. The answer lies out off the coast, in what scientists are now calling the Kelp Highway Hypothesis. While the inland continent was basically a frozen, uninhabitable wasteland, the coastlines of the northern Pacific Rim were a vastly different story. They hosted these highly productive kelp forests. This thriving marine ecosystem was absolutely rich in fish, shellfish, seabirds, and marine mammals. It was essentially a perfect, nutrient-rich highway of food for coastal hunter-gatherers. Let's walk step by step down this Pleistocene Eden to see exactly how this coastal migration worked. First, they used watercraft navigation skills they'd already developed over in Northeast Asia. Next, they island hopped along the Kurile chain towards North America. Third, they skirted right along the ice margins of the Pacific Northwest coast, relying entirely on all those rich marine foods from the kelp forests. And finally, because this coastal route was so packed with resources, it allowed for a remarkably rapid expansion southward, straight into the unglaciated parts of the Americas. Section 5. A complex new history. The paradigm shift complete. When you bring all of this evidence together, the 23,000-year-old mud dating in New Mexico, the genetic branching, that incredible coastal kelp highway, you realize we've completed a monumental paradigm shift. Just look at how widespread these pre-Clovis archaeological sites are across the map. We have White Sands at 23,000 years ago in the American Southwest, Cooper's Ferry up in Idaho at 16,000 years, Page Ladson over in Florida at 14,500 years, and Monte Verde all the way down in southern Chile, also at 14,500 years ago. The sheer geographical spread of these sites proves, without a doubt, that these coastal migrants moved incredibly fast. They were navigating and settling two massive continents way before the Clovis people even arrived on the scene. Honestly, the story of the first Americans is just a profound testament to human nature. They didn't just walk onto a new landmass. As the quote says, they walked into mystery, into danger, into a continent that would test them and change them, and ultimately become them. Driven by a mix of climate pressure, shifting resources, and just that deep-seated human curiosity, these people plunged into a totally unknown Pleistocene Eden, teeming with megafauna and glaciers. They faced it, they adapted to it, and they populated it all the way from the Arctic down to the very tip of South America. So here's the thing to think about. If footprints over 20,000 years old can be found perfectly preserved in the mud of New Mexico, what other mysteries are still buried out there? Perhaps there's more off the submerged ancient coastlines of the Pacific, or hidden deep in unexcavated caves. Science is constantly evolving, and the story of the first Americans is clearly far from over. Thanks for joining me to explore this explainer today. And hey, keep your eyes open for what we might dig up next.